Everyone, thank you very much for the invitation to talk to the International Scientific Conference, and I'm very happy to be able to give a little talk and answer some questions. I will send some questions by email, and I will try to answer these questions to the best of my ability. The first question asked me, and I read, the state of classical architecture and architectural education in St. Petersburg and in Russia. We know that St. Petersburg contains some of the most marvelous classical architecture in the world. I'm afraid I don't know what the state of classical architecture education is in Russian universities, so I cannot really answer that. However, there is a worldwide influence of Bauhaus-style modernism and deconstructivism, and I'm sure that has a huge influence in learning institutions in Russia as it does throughout the world. So without knowing what's happening, then I just hope that there is some tradition and some professors that can still teach classical education in Russia. I know that the practice of classical architecture continues in Russia, which is a wonderful thing, and historic preservation continues, so that there are many architects and technicians who can restore classical buildings, which is very important because every building needs restoration. Let me talk about what's happening here outside of Russia, where a classical building that needs restoration sometimes is destroyed by totally insensitive interventions, and that's a terrible thing. This practice occurs in Europe and in the United States, which is most unfortunate. I'm very happy that my book, Algorithmic Sustainable Design, 12 Lectures in Architecture, will soon appear in Russian, and I hope it will prove popular and instructive to students. I'm very happy about that. I've been asked a question about my criticism of modernist architecture, which is Bauhaus, and everything following that, postmodernism and deconstructivism. What I offered as an alternative. Well, I have written extensively about the alternative to those styles that have been with us for exactly 100 years. This is the Bauhaus centenary celebration. There are tools that will create human scale environments, and those tools involve patterns that have been documented by Christoph Alexander. And let me point out to everyone in the conference that Christoph Alexander's pattern language now exists in Russian. I have seen not the book itself, but I have seen it advertised and on sale on the internet in the Russian edition, which is just a few years old. So that's a extremely important tool because it uses evolved solutions that will create a human-scale architecture, and these solutions are discovered in traditional architecture and vernacular buildings throughout the world, and these are the invariant solutions. So here is one of the extremely important set of tools for creating a human-scale architecture. You will find that when you apply the patterns, then the results don't look anything like Bauhaus modernism or deconstructivism. So that's enough to totally throw out all those notions of stylistic minimalism, weird shapes, etc. The second set of tools comes from more recent results that are fully consistent with the pattern language, and those results are summarized in biophilia and biophilic design. These are results that we know which elements of the environment make us put us in a healing biological position so that they influence our health. These environments are healing environments, so that by spending time in them, our health is much better. This is the reason for this is because we have evolved as human beings, as animals, in a natural environment, and we require a certain geometry around us, and we require constant contact with living things as well as the essential geometry of living things. This is summarized in biophilia. Those rules are published and are being investigated. I have several papers out that are freely available on the internet. Other researchers are publishing results on biophilia. The last 5 years have seen intense documentation because of experiments by the medical profession around the world, who are validating results that we have proposed much earlier concerning biophilic environments. So if we have said that this particular element in the built environment is necessary for our health because of observations in architecture of the past, now we see the medical reasons why this proves to be essential for human health. And the third and very exciting and new discipline that is supporting all of this is neuroscience. Direct neuroscience experiments are starting to be performed, and they validate what we have been saying all along, namely that the qualities of a healing environment that use patterns of Christopher Alexander and that use biophilia do make a significant difference in our neurological responses. And now, for the first time, experiments to measure neurological responses are possible with very small apparatus and relatively inexpensive. Just to let you know, 15 years ago, you needed a whole room full of machines, and the subject to be measured for neurological responses had to be inside this giant machine. Whereas now you have something very, very small you can attach to your shoulder or your hand or wear as a hat and walk around and experience environments. This is a scientific breakthrough of major proportions, and it is totally unknown in traditional architecture and in the architectural power games that famous architects play. However, it is known to commerce, the advertising world, high tech, the computer industry, the car companies use all of these experimental small portable devices in order to measure the neurological responses, because they are interested to know about customer preference and about what feels better or what feels worse by provoking anxiety. They cannot hope to sell something that provokes anxiety. This is the opposite of the famous architects today that sell big buildings that make people anxious. Yet they, instead of being put in jail, they are awarded by prizes and by more commissions further down the road. So when I say that we have a toolbox of coming from various different directions, but all of it exists and all of it can be applied today. And even more important is that this is all free for anyone who can read English on the internet. And even if you can't read English, with Google Translate, you can translate online into Russian. So these are not the secret recipes that are available for everyone. Now, one of my friends in Russia who was organizing the conference asked me, these ideas do not correlate with Russian reality. Well, I don't know Russian reality, so I cannot say if that is true or not. However, I'm suspicious of that statement. Russia, like any other great civilization, has centuries and centuries of building tradition, vernacular building, all over the vast expanses of Russia. That's those building traditions are very faithful to biophilia and to patterns of Alexander, and they are they satisfy neurological responses because all of what I'm talking about it has been selected over history, over the evolutionary history of human beings, in order to give a building tradition that makes people feel healthy. Therefore, people who build their own houses follow a tradition because if there was a particular element of that tradition that made you feel unhealthy or sick, then that was eliminated in the past. So an inherited building tradition is by definition one that achieves biophilic design and uses Alexander's patterns. Of course, nobody knows these names. This is the building tradition is done unconsciously. It is a storehouse of cultural memory, and because something that works, and that's continued. Where this idea breaks down is in the intelligentsia, usually in the large cities, where influenced by these totally irrational ideas of false modernity, people build buildings at great expense that make you feel unease. They create anxiety. They could possibly make people sick in the long run. But the avant-garde architectural community and most of academia ignore this, as they ignore all the medical experiments that exist. That's why my group of friends who are promoting a human-scale architecture absolutely insist on publicizing the medical experiments on what is a healing environment and what makes people sick. Now, the patent language in the English, it was published in English, of course, in 1977, and only just a few years ago was available in Russian. There was one criticism of the patent language, which was a false criticism, but I need to address that because that criticism has lived on like a bad story, which is a false story. That criticism was that the patterns seem to give you something very specific, so that you take away from the creativity of the architect. That is a completely stupid statement, often repeated by architects because they are stupid themselves. The pattern language allows the combinatorics of an infinity of innovative designs. It is a set of constraints within which you have an infinity of possible designs. So the architects who belong to the established modernist type of Bauhaus or deconstructivist styles, then they claim to criticize working with the pattern language because it restricts their creativity. But that's absolute nonsense. If you can have an infinite number of possible solutions to a specific architectural problem, how is that restricted? The restriction is in that using pattern language and using biophilic design throws out some of those infinite solutions that can cause harm to the human user. That's what the fashionable architects object to. They don't want their hands to be tied so that they want to continue to cause harm to the human user. And I don't buy that. I think that's unethical and should not be accepted by society. So the techniques that we propose, that my friends and I write about and give out to be used by architects today, lead to a healing environment, a human-scale environment, and they allow infinite creativity within the constraints. The constraints, however, is what guarantee that you will have a healing environment and not an environment that creates anxiety. To go one step further, let's go earlier, since this is the Bauhaus centenary, and hundreds of thousands of architects just blindly followed the Bauhaus, which taught them to create cubes, plain white or gray cubes out of concrete or out of glass curtain walls. This is zero creativity. Everyone stupidly copying a cube. Only two choices: concrete or glass. This is the most ridiculous lie in the history of humankind. That contemporary architecture that is based upon Bauhaus modernism is innovative and has wonderful creativity. That's nonsensical. While working with patterns and biophilia restricts one's creativity. It's entirely the opposite, and this is just propaganda. And it's a sort of a power play that people in Russia should be familiar with, because it is a political power play acting in the architectural arena. Now, I was also asked to explain a little bit in greater detail about the courses that I have taught. The course that I taught from the book Algorithmic Sustainable Design did not have a structure. However, I videotaped those lectures, and they exist online, free. So if any student can go to my website and find Algorithmic Sustainable Design, and then follow the video lectures with the PowerPoint slides, and that's entirely for free. The book itself is just a revision of those PowerPoint slides with additional explanations for all of those points. I specifically made this an open course so that anyone around the world could follow it, and there was no grading, there were no assignments, because there was no way for me to get the feedback. So it was just an open. I was giving out information, and people followed it, and they gave me feedback by writing for me from all over the world, telling me how they learned very much from this experience, just following the lectures. So the book has been translated so that it makes it a little easier for those who can get the book in their own language, and then they can listen to me speak in the lectures in English and get a little bit more out of it. The problems that I had with teaching this material in later courses have almost exclusively to do with the courses that my students have taken before, because they come into the class totally biased. So I try to explain something to them, and they're not open to the explanation. They come in with a preconception, with a very biased preconception, and I try to tell them what is going on and to give it a scientific explanation, a mathematical basis. I explain the mathematics, I explain the science, I explain the biology, I explain the techniques that we use, and then I show them the applications in architecture, because this is essentially an architecture course. Yet many of the students have been so badly misinformed in their previous courses that when they find that what I'm telling them contradicts what I have learned from a previous course, they just panic. They don't know what to make of this. They cling on to what they have been told before by the previous professors. They see obviously that what I'm explaining makes sense, so they should accept it, but it makes them sick because of the contradiction. This is called a cognitive dissonance, and I have written a lengthy paper on that in English, translated also into several languages. The cognitive dissonance is when you're faced with two explanations that are opposite to each other. Which one do you choose? Well, even if one explanation is based on science and has all the validity in the world and it's obviously valid, but you may cling onto the other explanation, which is obviously false, because you have been comfortable with it for a while, and authority has given it to you. And we cannot underestimate the power of authority. When a student goes and learns something, even if it's total nonsense, they associate it with the authority of the teacher. So to get rapidly to a conclusion, the main problem that I have faced in my courses is the prior misinformation that is standard in architecture school, and I will explicitly say what it is. Their previous courses have shown them pictures of Bauhaus-style pictures, and they've said, this is the great architecture of our times, and everything else is no good. So the students have ingested this, and then they come to my course, and I tell them, well, no, it's the opposite. These cubes, concrete cubes and glass cubes are no good, except for maybe storage sheds, but not for human habitation. Whereas what the Bauhaus condemned as bad architecture, all the great architectural traditions of humankind with wonderful healing properties. That is where real architecture is, and we can create that today. And here is another point that creates tremendous cognitive dissonance. I tell my students, we have the techniques, we can create wonderful buildings today, not by copying classical models, okay? You can copy a classical model to make a bank, to make it look like a classical temple. Fine, you can do that, but what I'm talking about is creating a completely innovative building that has never been seen before, that has human scale, and it sort of reminds you of something from the past, but it's not a copy. It's an original creation. And my students don't know what to do with this, because they have been told in the previous courses that we cannot do that. That all we can create today are cubes, glass or concrete cubes. And they get totally frustrated. And some of them I can save, and they go on, and my students have gone on to become very, very, very successful. Some I could not save because they were just stuck in these ideas and couldn't get beyond their prior conditioning. You Russians should know. Your scientist Pavlov started the conditioning with the dogs salivating. That's what architecture schools do today around the world. They create experimental animals out of the students and make them salivate when they ring the bell. Namely, they tell them Bauhaus-style architecture is wonderful and everything else is no good. And then when the students are shown a new building that's minimalist and just a concrete cube, they salivate and they say this is great. But you try to deconditioning. Deconditioning is far, far more difficult than conditioning, as successors of Pavlov found out. Okay, I think I've said enough, and I wish you all a very pleasant conference. And I'm available for whoever wants to discuss these further. Just send me an email. Thank you. Bye-bye.